This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. This episode is sponsored by C-School, the online school for creativity training. If you'd like to unleash your creative potential and access a free Creativity Blueprint training series, then just head over to c.school. That's www.c.school for your free training series. In today's interview, I speak with Daniel McGinn, and we talk about how to deal with backstage nerves, the role of visualization, and creating your own pre-game rituals. Enjoy this episode. Hi, it's James Taylor. I'm delighted today to be joined by Daniel McGinn. Daniel McGinn is a senior editor at Harvard Business Review, where he edits the IdeaWatch and How I Did It sections, manages the magazine's annual Best Performing CEOs in the World ranking, and edits feature articles on topics including negotiation, sales, and entrepreneurship. He has appeared as a guest on NBC's Today Show, PBS, CNN, MSNBC, and NPR, as well as writing for magazines including Wired, Inc., and Fast Company. His latest book is called PSYCHED Up, How the Science of Mental Preparation Can Help You Succeed, and it's received wide praise, including from Katie Couric, Arianna Huffington, Charles Duhigg, and Brad Feld, amongst others. And it's my great pleasure to have Dan join us today. So welcome, Dan.
James, thank you so much.
So share with our listeners, what's going on in your world just now?
Oh, right now I'm editing articles for Harvard Business Review, and I'm still promoting my book, Psyched Up. So keeping busy and having fun.
And how did you kind of learn your craft? Where did the writing begin for you? Is it something you always done at a pretty early age, or is it something that's kind of come to you a little bit later in life?
So when I went to college, I actually wanted to be a banker. I wanted to work in finance, and I'd always really enjoyed writing, but I never really saw it as a way to make a living. But when I got to college, I started writing for the school paper and working on the school magazine, and I came out of college and decided to do business journalism. So I've never been just sort of a regular general writer. I've always written about business and management. I spent my 20s and 30s at Newsweek magazine as a journalist, writing almost every week. And I think that was the key to get into a job where you had a lot of repetition and did it a whole lot. And when I was 40, I came over to Harvard Business Review, and I've been doing it ever since.
So in this latest book, and you study how some of the best athletes, soldiers, and entertainers get themselves in the zone. What do you do for yourself to help yourself get in the zone, and has it changed after writing this book?
So writing the book and reporting the book definitely changed the way I approach the creative task. I do a few things. Number one, before I sit down to write, especially if it's something that's more challenging than usual or higher stakes, a piece of writing that feels really, really important. One of the things I'll do is I'll just take 2 or 3 minutes and go back and read something that I wrote years ago that I thought turned out very well. It's sort of like a greatest hit strategy. If you're a musician, you're going to write a whole lot of songs, but probably you'll be known for 1 or 2 of them. So go back and listen to that one before you record your next one. It reminds you of how successful you have been, and it sort of primes your body to do it again. The second thing is, and this is pretty simple, I work in an office where I've surrounded myself with reminders of past success. So when I look across the room, I can see a magazine article I wrote 10 years ago that did very well. I have little mementos of success around, and they're not, super obnoxious. They're not in your face. Nobody else really, they're not for anybody but me. Nobody really comes into this little writing office I have, but I sort of create an environment that feels very supportive, where I'm sort of looking at little trophies and things like that. And I have a keyboard that used to be owned by Malcolm Gladwell that I use sometimes because there's research that shows that if you use a tool or an object that was previously used by a high performer, it can help you perform better. So those are all kinds of techniques that came out of this book, because I've learned that before I sit down to do something important, I want to put myself in the right kind of mindset. So
that idea of the environment in which you're creating, the things that you have around you, how much does that, from the science of kind of looking at, how much does that have to play in succeeding, in performing at your best in the kind of work that you do? Or is it primarily, it's really just as a mental game, and actually you could be writing on a spaceship somewhere and it really wouldn't matter that much?
Well, so there was research done by a professor named Gary Latham at the University of Toronto that looked at what he calls visual priming. And so he conducted a bunch of these studies. He did most of them in university fundraising operations. And the basic scenario he would do in these studies is he'd have a sheet of instructions for the workers who were, calling out telephone solicitations, trying to get money, donors to donate money. Some of them would just have the regular sheet of paper. Some of them at the top of the sheet of paper, they'd see an inspirational image. I think it was typically like a person crossing the finish line in a marathon. Very subtle. Their attention was not drawn to it. It was just a successful image. And generally, people who viewed that image before doing the task did it better. And he did sort of all sorts of variations of this study. He did it with groups and collaboration. And the general conclusion from this is that if you're surrounded by something visual that connotes success to you, it can help you perform better.
Fascinating. And in this book, you reveal something, and I know this for many of our listeners who are performers, whether they're speakers or they're musicians or they're actors, are going up on the stage. And many of them will get, they get those nerves before they go on. They get those nerves backstage. We often hear this idea you should be just trying to calm yourself down before you go up stage and kind of deal with it that way. In your book, you reveal why kind of trying to do that is actually maybe not the best strategy.
Right. When you're nervous before you're performing, you have to recognize that that's a biological response. Our bodies have been programmed over thousands of years to go into this fight or flight mode. Our bodies release adrenaline, and that's what's causing the heartbeat to go up, the respiration to go shallow, the blinking, the perspiration, all the physical markers of that stage fright. And it'd be great if we could just tell ourselves to calm down and that would do it. But you're really fighting against biology at that point. It's not the most effective strategy.
And we've also, in recent years, I was at a very, very well-known music school recently, and classical music school, and they were actually talking about how many of them are using for their exams, are using like almost like beta blockers, things you would normally associate with people with heart conditions for older people, but they're using it as a way of kind of preparation. In the book, did you kind of look into those areas about like drugs, either on the biological side or things that affected on more than the kind of psychological side, in terms of helping people prepare?
I did. When I started reporting the book, I'd never heard of beta blockers before, but I kept running into people who told me they would take it before public speaking. I met a woman who got a prescription before she needed to give a eulogy because she was very nervous about that kind of performance. The more I heard about it, the more curious I got. There's a whole chapter in my book about them. You're right. They're a cardiac medication. Somebody won the Nobel Prize for inventing them back in the 60s. But in the 70s, people started to realize that the same thing that was making your body's blood pressure lower, that this drug sort of reduces your reaction to adrenaline. So a lot of the physical markers of being nervous start to go away when you take these drugs, for some people at least. So, you always have to be careful about prescription medication. You have to consult a doctor and all that. But I'd say if you're somebody for whom this performance anxiety is becoming really debilitating and it's negatively impacting your career, it's probably something you should take a look at with your doctor.
And in this book, you kind of go through a number of different ways that people can help kind of use what we know in terms of science and different strategies to help them prepare to succeed. Is there a kind of a quick guide of things, maybe someone that's listening to this just now, some simple strategies they can start to implement in their own lives to kind of just help them on that preparation stage?
Sure. Well, at the highest level, the way I think about it, imagine you've got a stereo in front of you with 3 knobs on it. You want to sort of tune those knobs to optimize your performance. The way I think about it, you want to try to crank down your anxiety level or find ways to at least manage and control the anxiety. You want to crank up the confidence level. You want to do things that make you feel like you're going to succeed before you go into that room. And then the third thing is you need to manage your energy level so that it's appropriate to what you're going to be doing. If you're going to be giving a classical violin concert versus a rock concert, those are very different kind of energy levels. If you're going to be speaking to 15 people versus 1,000 people, you need a different energy level. So the book is filled with techniques to do these 3 things, but those are generally the 3 knobs that I think you want to think about turning.
Something we often hear a lot in terms of mental preparation. I hear it amongst actors, I hear it amongst public speakers and other business people is kind of visualization exercises. And obviously with, this kind of goes back a long time, many years, in terms of people talking about visualization exercises to help someone prepare. What did you find in terms of the science? Is there science to back up this idea of using some kind of visualization to help you prepare for something?
There is, and you can do it in at least two different ways. So there are some people who really like to visualize backwards onto past performances. I mentioned earlier the idea that before I write an article, I go back and read an old article that did very well for us. That's basically visualizing my past success in order to try to drive my future success. But you can definitely prospectively visualize. So a lot of times, if somebody's about to give a big speech, it absolutely makes sense to go and check out the venue the day before or the morning of, so that you know exactly. So not just so you get comfortable and familiar with it, but so you can visualize yourself in that setting. At work, I have a meeting that I have to go to every few weeks where I need to pitch my ideas, and I make a point to always sit in the same chair. And it's not superstition or anything. It's because when I visualize myself in that meeting a week from now, I know where I'm going to be sitting. I know what the room's going to look like. Anything you can do to sort of make yourself be more present and can sort of project yourself into that moment ahead of time, the better off you're going to be.
So this is where we hear athletes, for example, they'll have their favorite socks, or they'll have their little kind of talisman, this little something that they have. Is that really about helping them anchor maybe previous sensations and previous feelings?
So it can be. So when people have lucky objects or superstitious objects, sometimes it is about, I was wearing red socks the last time I won a race, therefore I'm going to wear red socks again. It will help me win the race. So there is some of that. And there's actually, there's a lot of research that suggests it's true. I mean, you can call it the placebo effect if you want to, but if your mind thinks that something is going to help you, your mind can, it becomes a virtuous circle where it really does help you. But the other thing that comes into play with these objects is the human body craves habit and it craves a routine. It likes things that happen the same way every time. So for a lot of people, these objects will become part of a larger set of routines that they do before they perform, whether you're, a Broadway actor or a singer or an athlete, or military people even have them. So trying to sort of get into like a launch sequence where you're doing the same thing every time before you perform, that helps your body recall the practice you've done. It helps reduce your anxiety. It can just be a way to boost your performance.
And I'm wondering, you mentioned this idea of prospective visualization as well. Can that also work on a negative side? So instead of necessarily having projecting forward in a positive way, actually projecting forward to okay, if I don't do this thing, if I don't get over this fear, then this is not going to be good. And really, kind of, I'm thinking of something like Seneca here, who used to do kind of, I suppose, a version of this, like negative visualizations. Imagine what the very worst thing that could happen, and that kind of helped him get over the fear of doing that thing. Was there anything that you found in your research and talking to all these athletes and these business people, entrepreneurs, around the more negative side, which we maybe don't speak about so much?
Yeah, so there's a psychological technique called defensive pessimism, and it's roughly what you're describing. So a defensive pessimist basically imagines the worst case scenario and then tries to rationalize and say why it won't be so bad. So imagine that I was going to go on a job interview this afternoon. Instead of being confident and positive and thinking what a great job I'm going to do, on the drive there, I could say to myself, well, I'm probably going to mess this up, but it's okay because I have a great job anyway. And if I change jobs, I'd have a new boss and I'd have a new commute. So you can kind of rationalize why this bad outcome really isn't that bad. In general, the research suggests that's a bad thing to do. You're much better off thinking positively what you do want to do than trying to sort of, imagine the worst case and then paper it over somehow. But a lot of people do have an inclination to do that. Before I reported this book, I tended to do that myself a bit.
And in your own kind of creative journey for your own work, is there maybe a time where you've worked on something, an article, a book, and you've given it your heart and your soul. You put everything into it. You think you've prepared, and you think you've kind of covered everything, but it just didn't work out like you'd hoped. And more importantly, what did you learn from that experience, and how did you use that in future preparations for other articles?
Sure. So I've been a magazine writer for 25 years now. So I've absolutely had articles that didn't work out as well as I wanted to, and some of them that never even got published because they worked out so poorly. I think the trick with that is to kind of manage the table stakes. And, if you're in an environment where you get a lot of repetition, where you're writing a whole lot, and it's kind of like in a casino, you're better off making a whole lot of small bets and avoiding putting all of your chips on this one really important thing. And so I think trying in a creative life, trying to make sure that you're not over investing in a few really important things, and that you're spreading your bets around. And then it's hard, but trying to be analytical when something fails. On the one hand, you want to move on quickly and not dwell on the negative. But on the other hand, you do want to try to learn what went wrong, and you want to try to prevent those failures from happening again. So it's sort of this interesting balance between learning what you can from the failure, but not dwelling on it so that it upsets your mindset going forward.
And as you were writing the book, as you were writing kind of Psyched Up, was there maybe a particular aha moment in that where you went, okay, you had maybe a particular insight in terms of maybe your own mental preparation for writing, or you just got a better sense, especially in people that are doing very kind of creative endeavors, writing, for example, about things that could really help them in the work that they do?
So I think the biggest revelation when I was writing the book, and I think the biggest single takeaway that people can take from the book, is that we associate this idea of getting psyched up with athletes, with big football players or Olympic athletes, Michael Phelps or whoever. Our jobs are not like that. Most of us go to an office every day. We're not wearing spandex bathing suits to work. But our jobs do have a performance element to them, and many of our jobs, one day is not the same as the next. Every quarter there's going to be one big sales call that's either going to help you make your quota or not make your quota, or there's going to be some sort of a tryout or a project where you need to present. So the basic argument in the book is that these techniques used to be just for athletes, but now many, many of us in lots of different kinds of work can benefit if we learn how to do these things.
So essentially kind of discovering your own pregame kind of ritual then, and whether you're sitting down to write, but kind of getting yourself in that zone, having some strategies to be able to ensure that when you do have to do your creative work, you're at your best.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about a very pressurized situation, think about a job interview, or think about a sports tryout. I have 3 children, and today one of them is trying out for a sports team, which for a 13-year-old, that's about as high stakes as it gets, right? When he's waiting to go in there, and when I'm waiting to go into a job interview, we have a choice. We can just sit there being nervous and not really having a plan, or we can have something constructive and proactive and a scheme in place of the things we're going to be thinking about, the actions we're going to do, a sequence. And generally, having a plan is going to be better than just sitting there and being nervous.
Fascinating. And as you were kind of going through, I mean, we mentioned like the drug, so that's kind of an artificial way of preparing perhaps and dealing with kind of mental preparation. When you're starting to see now things like artificial intelligence, like neural networks, and almost, we're starting to perhaps move towards those ideas where there will be more artificial, i.e. AIs and stuff to help us prepare. Were there any things in terms of potential signposts, or you got a sense of like, this is maybe where we're going when it comes to this kind of blend of human and machine on preparation?
That's a really interesting question. That's a question I haven't encountered before. The one thing that I did come across in the book is I found people who basically had an ability for certain kinds of performance to go into a sort of autopilot mode, which was almost as if they they had practiced the routine so much. So I encountered a speaker. He was an entrepreneur. His business involved giving a lot of different kinds of speeches. And he almost never gave the same speech twice. Every week he was in front of a lot of people giving a different kind of talk. But what he did was, no matter what the talk was, he made it so that the first 3 or 4 minutes was exactly the same every time. His introduction was just standard. And he'd done it so many times, he didn't have to think about it. He knew it inside and out. So he could get on that stage, and when you get on a stage, the first couple moments are the most intimidating. They're the time when you're the most nervous. And he wouldn't be nervous at all because he'd essentially turned it over to the computer. He turned it into an autopilot kind of task. So that doesn't actually involve artificial intelligence or computers, but it shows how you can kind of routinize something to the point where you do it without even thinking the way a computer would.
And while we're talking about computers and technology as well, do you, as a writer, do you have an online resource or a tool or an app like Evernote that you find really useful for doing the kind of creative work that you do?
So probably, I like a lot of writers, I use a bunch of different tools. The one that I lean on a lot anymore is actually the camera on my phone, which I use as a note-taking device. Back before we had carried our cameras around with us, if I was out as a reporter with my notepad, I would take a lot of notes about what a room looked like or what a person looked like or a scene. And now I'm much more inclined to just very discreetly snap a picture of this, snap a picture of that. So when I come back to the office and I'm starting to write the story, I have not just a lot of handwritten notes and not just a lot of tape recordings of interviews with people, but I also have photography, not great photography, just little snapshots on my camera phone of what was there. And so it helps me to be more visual as a writer, and it's often better than what I would have scratched down in my notepad anyway.
And I know so much of creativity can be a very an activity, like a team activity. You're working on a great magazine, and you have different editors, you have different writers kind of working all the time. Is there a role in that kind of mental preparation for someone else in terms of helping you with that mental preparation? I don't know necessarily whether it's in the form of a coach or whether someone can just kind of help you kind of tap into that thing that makes you uniquely you.
So there's two things that come to mind with that. Number one, when you're working in a team setting, when you're thinking about what you're going to do before the event, very often a group ritual of some sort can be useful. One of the people I spoke with while reporting the book was a Broadway actress named Laura Donnelly, and on her last show on Broadway, the director made the 4 principal actors who used to just go off on their own and do yoga and do their own sort of private psych up. He made them come together and play a sort of a game together to get connected before the show. And she said it was revelatory. It really made a huge difference. The second thing that can happen in a group setting is that you can use a pep talk. Whoever the leader or the coach or the manager is, whether it's a military setting or a sports setting or often in a sales setting, the sales manager needs to give a pep talk to try to get people psyched up. And there's actually a science of what works in those talks as well that I get into in the book. So when you get into a group setting, it's often finding the right words to motivate other people.
I'm suddenly reminded of that scene from I think it was Glengarry get Glen Ross, where the Alec Baldwin character goes into the pep talk. It may be a slightly more negative way, but I guess you could argue it got results at the same time. I'm guessing in your role, you have to read so many books all the time because you're continually looking to see what's next. Where is the research leading? You can have that natural curiosity as an editor as well. If there was one book that you could recommend to our listeners, you think they should check out, and it could be on the area that you're writing about kind of mostly just now, or on something else, what would that book be?
That's a tough question. Any question that narrows it down to one is always hard. Probably the nonfiction writer whose work I admire most is Malcolm Gladwell. So, I've read all of his books. My favorite of them is Outliers. In terms of the kind of model I would hold up if I were trying to model something, it'd be that. The other thing that I think can be really useful for creative types is about habits and discipline. And the two people who've written most about that, whose work I find most compelling, are Charles Duhigg, who wrote The Power of Habit, and he's written another book on productivity, and Gretchen Rubin, whose latest book is called The Four Tendencies, that looks at what kind of structures help people stay focused and meet their obligations. So I think that set of writers for me has helped me think about how I work and making sure that I'm productive and creative and meeting my obligations.
I'm going to make you narrow things down again. Then, in terms of an album, is there one album that you find yourself listening to more? And it could be because it's something you like having on the background when you write, or maybe you don't have any music, you find it distraction when you write. But is there one album you should suggest our listeners check out?
So there's actually a whole chapter in my book about motivational music, and the biggest thing I learned from reporting that chapter is that music is super, super personal. So I could tell you what my song is, but it wouldn't be the same as your song. I think it's much more useful for people to actually do the work and try to figure out what the song is themselves. And often it's music that they have an emotional connection with. So I would look back at the song, the songs that played at your wedding or the songs that played at the high school dance. Oftentimes music that hit us during that pivotal moment in our lives has this resonant power. So rather than me, naming a song or two, I think I'd encourage people to find their own song. And
do you actually use music much in the background when you're writing, or do you find it a distraction?
So if I'm actually writing, I find it a distraction, and there's research on that as well. I tend to prefer quiet a lot of the time. I'm pretty introverted as a person, and so people, if you didn't grow up with music, if you're an introvert, you tend not to like to write to music. If I have to, I'll use classical, or I'll use masking music that tries to, if I'm writing in a noisy environment, then I might put something on just to avoid the noise. But that's pretty typical for people. There are people, especially extroverts or people who grow up in loud environments who do love writing to music. That's just not me, though.
So, Dan, a final kind of question for you here. Let's imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you have all the skills as a writer, but you have no contacts. No one knows who you are. You know no one. You have to restart. What would you do? How would you restart?
I think I'd start by reading and trying to figure out the group of writers and publications that I admired and I aspired to, and then I'd probably start emailing out some introductions and some, complimenting other people on their work, asking if I can help. It's a very perceptive question you ask, because knowledge without a network is really hard to do a whole lot with. So if you've got the skills and the knowledge, my first step would be to try to take steps to rebuild that network. And I'd start by figuring out the places I admired and the people I admired.
So this book we've been talking about today, Psyched Up, How the Science of Mental Preparation Can Help You Succeed. We're going to have a link. If you go to jamestaylor.me, just type in Daniel McGinn, you're going to find the link to the book, plus everything else we've been talking about today. If people want to reach out to you directly, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
So I'm on Twitter at Dan McGinn, and I'm on every day. And I've had a lot of great conversations with people who've read the book and people who are just discovering the book. So I'd welcome that.
Well, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. You've definitely got me thinking about my own pre-game rituals when it comes to creativity as well. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.